Tonight we have 4 stories, some of the creepiest we've had in a long time. From exploring a cave, rattling pipes, creatures in a library, and a security guard who bit off more than he could chew. A huge thank you to the generous authors who have allowed me to share these stories with all of you. This video would not be possible without them. Please be sure to drop a like and comment if you enjoy. Also, if you enjoy and you're new to the channel, consider subscribing. I post new long narrations all the time. Enjoy the video. And as always, I hope you all have a great night.
Hello, Team A7. This is radio operator Tom Clemens reporting. New job. Some fancy rich neighborhood a distance away from here. Type B, normal security guarding duty. Use of lethal force to be a last resort. These folks are going to be paying both of you for 4 hours.
The radio was on and our shoulder lights were blinking once more. I looked at Mike and high-fived him. Tonight was yet again going to be an easy cash grab. A bit about myself first. I work as a threat management officer, fancy term for security guard and private police, for a small private security company stationed in my hometown. We usually operate in the more crime-ridden parts of the city, where we protect stores and homes, charging our customers by the minute and by how dangerous the job is. Tonight, a cool and breezy Thursday, it was a Type B run, meaning an ordinary security patrol with near minimal risk. Mike and I would be bringing along our flashlights, stun guns, and batons. It was around 9 p.m. and pitch black when our Jeep arrived at the outskirts of the forest, where our supposed patrol location was supposed to be. I was confused. "Come in, Tom. Are you sure this is the right place? You said some rich fancy neighborhood. All I can see here are trees, and I don't think trees pay well," I said into the radio. Mike had stepped outside of the Jeep to look around.
Yeah. Apparently the neighborhood is inside the forest. Supposed to be a rich people thing. There's around 20 houses in there, all within this cul-de-sac.
The radio answered. I ain't ever heard of, nor seen any rich people go out of town to live in the forest. And in all my years living here, I've never heard of an enclave of wealthy residents within an isolated forest. Something's a bit off about this, I said to Mike, as he walked back towards the Jeep. Mike nodded. Still, it's good money, Jack. And if they don't pay up front, we leave. Here, I found the path into the trees. Mike stepped into the Jeep, and soon we were accelerating past the thick trees and shapeless bushes. The path was completely dark, and our only source of light was from the Jeep itself. The atmosphere outside felt a bit too noiseless and quiet, the silence being broken by the Jeep's wheels crushing the occasional fallen tree branch. The neighborhood itself was a different story. As we pulled up to it, we realized that there were several well-lit houses and dozens of street lamps scattered around the cul-de-sac. Except for a man standing at the entrance gate between the forest road and the neighborhood, there was no one. $960. Here we go, the guard, or whatever he was, said, as he opened the gates and handed Mike a briefcase through the open windows of the Jeep. The folks here told me to give this to you when you came. I'll be leaving now. And with that, the only living soul we actually saw began walking off in the direction which we had come. Mike counted the money. $2 for every minute per person, multiplied by 2 people, multiplied by 60 minutes, multiplied by 4. And here we have 96 $10 notes. Yep, it's the correct amount. I nodded, and slowly drove past the open metal gate, which shut behind us automatically. The neighborhood was silent. Something really felt off. Maybe it was the fact that all the houses were brightly lit, yet there was no one we could actually see in them, or outside of them. Maybe it was the forest, the dark tree line where one branch seemed to merge with another, one tree indistinguishable from another, the mess of blurred, barely visible shapes surrounding the cul-de-sac, which was putting us off. Maybe it was because all the houses looked exactly identical to each other from the outside. All 2-story bungalows with garages as big as my own house. But whatever it was, Mike and I didn't feel comfortable. We parked our Jeep near the entrance and stayed inside it, locking our doors. For a while, not much happened. The clock slowly seemed to tick by. Half an hour passed, then an hour. It was soon 10:30 p.m. and Mike and I were close to falling asleep, wrapped in our warm company-issued blankets, meant to be used for comforting trauma victims, but nobody said we couldn't use it. When all of a sudden, the lights all throughout the cul-de-sac went out. Every single one. The 20 houses went dark, and their windows illuminated previously by bright indoor lamps switched off simultaneously. The street lamps flickered and died in synchrony, and outside, we saw the leaves on the trees shaking. Mike stared outside in disbelief and whispered, his voice soft and shaking, "Jack?" Either these homes all have their light sources synced up, or there's something here trying to mess with us. I don't feel safe. Let's head back out and tell the company that. Relax, Mike. It's just rich people, I'm sure. If these fellas can afford 2-story bungalows to be lit in this sort of secluded area, then they can afford whatever contraptions they want. Let's just sit back and rest. I want every single cent from my share of $480. I said, closing my eyes. I was starting to get very drowsy in the back of the Jeep, and as soon as I finished speaking, the sounds began. High-pitched screams like that of a female's suddenly filled our ears, and I sat up in fright, instinctively reaching for my stun gun. Mike sat upright on the driver's seat, began to look around from behind the windshield with eyes wide open and bulging in terror. The screams continued, becoming shriller and shriller, until our ears almost went deaf. I put my gloved hands around my head and dug my head in between my thighs until the screaming finally stopped. It's a Type 2 contract, so it means we are supposed to check on these people too. I guess we have no choice, Mike said as he turned around. His face was pure white, and I could see the sweat on his forehead. I nodded. Only a quick check, and then we will return to our cars, I added. As we slowly unlocked the Jeep doors, we felt an extremely cool breeze beginning to rustle the tree line around us. The night was dark and the moon was obscured by clouds. I led the way, using my own torchlight, until we came to the bungalow where we thought the noise had emerged from. Apprehensively, with Mike standing on the right and myself standing on the left side of the doorway, I rapped my knuckles upon the door, and nothing happened. We waited for a while, before deciding it was best we head back to the Jeep. The both of us had nothing to defend ourselves with, so we began running back to the Jeep. When we were a few feet away from our vehicle, however, we heard the door from the very same house creak open. Mike was the first to turn around, and from a few feet behind me, I could hear his absolutely primal and guttural yells of terror. At that point, I could feel my hands and feet turning ice cold, and when I turned around, I saw Mike standing still, his back facing me. I peered further beyond, and my God, the door was open, revealing behind it and within the house a completely pitch-black void. Right in front of it, slowly crawling down the steps onto the front lawn and driveway, was an emaciated and bony humanoid figure. It was crawling on all fours, its pale, whitish-gray legs and arms bent almost 90 degrees at the knees and elbows, respectively. The thing's face was facing downwards, and completely obscured by the long, thick strands of black hair hanging down low enough to touch the floor. I froze in fear for a second, and was completely mesmerized by the spider-like movements of the creature. Its neck was long, longer than a human's, and it stretched out into the air by a few inches, before moving and twisting about in all directions, like a cobra moving its head about in the air. When the creature's head was finally pointing in our direction, a noise, a mix between the screeching of the tires of a car, the yelling of a human, and the screaming of a kettle, began to originate from within it. Mike was still frozen in fear, but I was not. Calling out to him, I jumped into the Jeep in the driver's seat and turned around expecting to see my colleague right behind me. Yet the fool was still outside, standing as stiff as a rock. From the corner of my eye, I could see the creature skittering towards us, its thin limbs moving with the speed and agility a human could not match. Within the blink of an eye, it was closing onto Mike. As the creature was barely a few dozen feet away from Mike, I stepped out, stun gun in hand. Mike was still standing, facing towards the direction of the creature with his back turned on me, as I pointed my weapon at the creature. The thing, as soon as it was barely a few feet away from me, leapt, and I pulled on the trigger of my weapon. The 2 needles coursed through the air and directly hit the creature as its face was exposed to me. Beneath the strands of long, wiry hair obscuring most of its facial features, I could see 2 partially covered eye sockets, both of which were empty and composed of dry, peeling skin. The creature fell upon the ground convulsing and twitching, and I pulled at Mike's shoulder to force him to turn his face at me and head back to the Jeep. What I saw next shall never leave me. It was Mike still, but his face was gone. The facial features, the nose, the eyes, the lips, his mouth, they were gone. His face was creased with layers upon layers of his own skin, and the chin was now fused to the rest of the neck by what appeared to be even more thick, flabby skin. The skin itself was moving, as if something from underneath it was crawling and wriggling about it, and flaps of it rose and fell along with the movement. Mike's hands reached out to me and grabbed the sides of my 2 arms. I could hear muffled noises coming from within what was once his face. Dragging him into the Jeep, I restrained him to the seats and began driving away, knocking past the gate entrance. From my rearview mirror, I could see the creature slowly get up and look around, and I noticed the front doors on all the houses were now open. So what prompted you to actually go into that forest? The man asked, placing his hands on the table. I looked down at my feet. We thought it was just another routine call. We should have checked procedure. Damn right you should have. Your friend? He's dead. Doctors say they've never seen anything like it before. Died an agonizing death, too. There's a reason we have procedure. I dared not look up and nodded. We'll let you keep your job. If your account holds true, that was brave of you. You've got the guts at least. Go and report to your radio operator outside. I stood up and left. Tom, the radio operator, was waiting for me outside the debriefing room. He stared at me, frown on his face. Jack, you of all people should know that I don't take the Thursday night shift. It started small. It took me a while to really get worried. But now I'm afraid for my life. Let me back up a bit. Chris is a geologist, and the man, bless his heart, loves rocks more than anyone should. I've known him since we were 5 years old, and even then, he brought home stones from the riverbed all the time and had 6 pet rocks. When we were teenagers, his love led him to picking up several rock-related hobbies. Hiking, rock climbing, hanging out in the gems and minerals exhibit at our local museum. I never minded. It was kind of sweet, really, how passionate he was, and it's not like I didn't realize what I was signing up for. On our first date sophomore year of high school, he took me to his favorite climbing wall. Then we walked to a diner nearby and got milkshakes, where he excitedly told me all about stratification. But after he was done, he happily listened to me go off on tangents about the pieces I'd learned to play on my violin, so it balanced out. It's been 9 years since then, and against all odds, his love for rocks has only grown in adulthood. He doesn't even get his fill at work. On weekends, we go hiking up mountains or rappelling down cliffs, or at least, we used to. This all started about 3 weeks ago. Chris went spelunking with a few friends from work who are just as rock obsessed. Some friend groups nerd out over sports teams or D&D. They do the same old caves, especially untouched ones under the mountain. One of his friends, Jackson, had found it by accident a week before while hiking off trail, and the second he told them about it, excited plans were being made to venture inside. The opportunity to be the first to explore an uncharted cave was too good to pass up, both as career geologists and as passionate enthusiasts. They decided to go the very next weekend, of course. Chris invited me, but I had rehearsals for an upcoming concert, and besides, caves aren't my thing. Rock climbing, sure. Hiking, hell yeah. But caves have always made me feel a little uneasy. To be honest, I think I felt anxious even about him and his friends entering that completely unknown cave. Caves can be deadly even for people who know what they're doing, after all, and this one was a complete question mark. No maps, no charts, nothing. But he was so excited. I couldn't voice my fears and rain on his parade. He kissed me goodbye early Saturday and promised to take plenty of photos. I rolled over sleepily and wished him luck. The first sign that something had gone wrong was their early return. The trip was supposed to be the whole weekend. They'd be back Sunday, late. They'd brought sleeping bags and everything so that they could even sleep in the cave Saturday night. But that didn't happen. That evening, as I was laying on the couch watching Netflix to wind down before bed, the rehearsal had been a rough one. The front door slammed open. My heart almost jumped out of my chest, but it was only Chris. Dirty, disheveled, and missing a boot. But still my husband. I was happy to see him, of course, but he'd been gone less than 18 hours. I figured something must have happened. Maybe the cave had collapsed years or decades earlier and they couldn't actually venture very far inside. "You're home early?" I said from the couch. "Everything okay?" Chris said nothing. He didn't even acknowledge my words with a grunt or a turn of the head. He walked right past me and up the stairs. I called after him and got no response. Okay, that was a little annoying, but mostly I was worried. If he was this zoned out, something worse than I'd thought must have happened. Maybe one of his friends had gotten injured. Turned off the television and followed him to our bedroom, where he was already laying in bed on his side. I sat down beside him. "Honey, please tell me what's wrong. Can I help?" I reached out to rub his back, and the second my hand touched him, he sat upright as if he'd been jolted awake. Before I could ask anything else, he leaned over and kissed me, and kept kissing me intensely. I kissed him back a few times, but then firmly pushed him off. He immediately tried to come back and resume the makeout session, his hands reaching for my waist. I pushed that away too, and said, "Tell me what happened first." He met my eyes for the first time since arriving home. Something was off about them. I couldn't put my finger on it. I hoped it was just my eyes playing tricks in the dark. Nothing happened. Everything is okay. "Can I help?" I asked again. "Yeah," he said, almost moaning. "I want you. I want you." He came in for another kiss. I almost pushed him off again, but then his hands began to caress my back, and I melted against his touch. He was physically fine, and maybe acting a little weird, but nothing too insane. It's probably something that could wait until the morning. And we were actively trying for our first baby, with our strategy currently being, just have sex every day and see if it works. So if he was here, and saying he was alright, surely getting intimate wouldn't make things worse. Might even make him feel better and want to open up about why he was back early. So I didn't push him away that time. He fell asleep almost immediately after we were done, which was unusual. We usually cuddled and talked for a while first. But I didn't mind too much since he was clearly tired. That was only the beginning though. The next morning, he was gone before I woke up, even though it was a Sunday. He left his phone on the nightstand, so I didn't have a way to contact him. I was a little pissed about that, but I had to go to rehearsals for most of the day anyway. When I got home, he was back. And before I could figure out where he'd been, he was on top of me again, kissing and fondling and moaning, "I want you," all over again. It made me feel loved, and his enthusiasm the last few days made me believe he really wanted a baby as much as I did. He'd been the one of us to be a little more hesitant, a little less sure that we were ready, so the fact that he had now jumped on board with my efforts made me happy. It was almost enough to make me forget about his refusal to talk about the cave, or his avoidance of the subject of his whereabouts. Almost enough. Throughout that week, he continued to be all over me. It was every night, and sometimes in the mornings too, but he'd always roll over or get up after, and I missed our cuddling and talking time. Still though, if that was all, I could live with that. It wasn't though. He started acting weirdly in other ways. I woke up several times in the middle of the night to find him staring at me with hunger in his eyes and a creepy smile on his face. If he noticed I was awake, he never acknowledged it. His clothes were odd, too. Not the clothes themselves, but their cleanliness. They always seemed to be caked in dirt and grime, and by the end of the day were more brown than whatever color they'd been originally. I knew it wasn't from work, because he worked in a research lab. Chris usually did the laundry, and now he insisted on it. I think he didn't want me to see whatever was on the clothes up close. I did, though. Once. I snuck in and looked one evening when I got home early. They were so caked with dirt that they were stiff, and they smelled like rotting leaves, and I swear I saw a worm crawling through the armhole, but I wasn't about to look closer. I tried to confront him. Really, I did. But he suddenly talked a lot less than he used to. Before the trip, he would talk my ear off at dinner about whatever rocks he'd been reading about or studying last. And now he said very little besides, "I want you." If I asked him direct questions, he'd respond with short answers, but the passionate ramblings were nowhere to be seen. And when I tried to bring up the clothes, he looked at me with his big, slightly different eyes and said, in the most menacing voice I'd ever heard him use, "They're not important. Don't bring them up again." I was worried, obviously. Was this what a nervous breakdown looked like? But he wouldn't talk to me, so it was time to go to people who would. His friends. I visited Jackson about 10 days after the cave trip. When he answered the door, I had to fake a cough to hide my gasp of shock. Jackson looked awful. Pale, disheveled, his hands wrapped in bandages, bags under his eyes that wouldn't qualify as carry-on luggage. He didn't seem all that surprised to see me, and he gestured for me to follow him into his apartment. "This is about Chris, isn't it?" He asked as we settled onto his couch, one of us on either side. Chris and I had spent many evenings here for movie nights and hangouts, and it felt wrong to be here without him. "Is he okay?" "I was hoping to ask you the same thing," I said. He sighed. "I wouldn't know, since he hasn't been at work since the cave." This was news to me. If he hadn't been at work every weekday, where the hell had he been going for 12 hours at a time? And why? Whatever it was that where the dirt was coming from? Jackson must have seen the shock on my face because he looked at me, brow furrowed. He did tell you what happened in the cave, didn't he?" I shook my head, my heart pounding. Jackson cursed, then apologized, then explained. "We all promised we'd tell someone we trusted. I told my sister, because it was just so goddamn creepy. Even if they didn't believe us, at least there'd be a trail, in case, anything happened to us." I was sitting on my hands now, trying desperately to resist the urge to chew on my nails, a bad habit I could never quite break as my nerves worsened. At the very least, Chris had broken a promise to his friends, which was already vastly out of character. At the worst, well, I wasn't sure. But it sure seemed like something terrible. "What would happen to you afterwards? Why would you worry about that? You made it out." I choked out, my voice laced with more fear than I'd hoped. Jackson sighed and ran a bandaged hand through his hair, wincing as he did so. "I should probably start at the beginning, though we don't know much, honestly." He paused, took a deep breath, and began. "When we got into the cave, everything went well for the first few hours. We were talking and laughing, and going deeper and deeper into the mountain. There was only one tunnel, so it was a clear path. Way easier than any of us had been expecting. We just followed the bends and slopes without much trouble. But then the cave changed." My heartbeat quickened. "What do you mean?" "The tunnel got smaller until we had to crawl. The only way forward was to squeeze through a crevice that was dripping some kind of black liquid. None of us had ever seen anything like it in any lab." He sighed again. "Oh, we should have turned back. God, I wish we had. But the crevice was large enough for one person at a time to fit through, and we hadn't had much of a challenge yet. So one by one, we squeezed through. Chris went first. I went last because I stopped to get a sample of the black ooze." He took a shaky breath. I wanted to encourage him, but what could I say? I stayed silent and placed my hand on his shoulder, which seemed to help. When I made it through to the other side, the others had vanished. I mean, like, into thin air. There was nowhere for them to go. It was a small cavern, maybe 10 feet across. The only one tunnel leading off it, but I crawled through only a minute or two after Chris, and all three of them were just gone. But you found them again? I asked. He closed his eyes briefly. Kind of. I heard them calling out from 3 different locations, and I called back. I started to walk down that tunnel. It was impossible to tell where all the voices were coming from. Then I heard screams, so I started running. I was just turning anywhere I could, trying to get wherever the screaming was, and soon I did. I swallowed hard. I came into a bigger cavern. Evan was laying on the ground, crying and holding the side of his head and frantically insisting that something had crawled into his ear and was burrowing deeper into his brain. Keith was sitting a few feet away, bleeding from a massive wound on his side. Something bit me, he said. Something big and dark, and I swear it said it wanted me. That made me uneasy. Didn't that sound eerily like what Chris had been saying? But Jackson hadn't even mentioned him yet. Where was Chris? I whispered, almost afraid to hear the answer. I don't know, but he came jogging in a minute later. I asked him if he was alright since the other 2 were in bad shape, and I had no idea what might have happened to Chris. But he just nodded and said nothing. I figured maybe he was shell-shocked. You know, because he was kind of staring off into space and his eyes looked funny. My heart almost stopped. His eyes looked funny? Yeah, said Jackson. I can't really describe how, but they were wrong. Something was off. Besides that, he was okay. So we decided we needed to get out of there and go to the hospital ASAP for the other 2 guys. I wasn't sure if they could make it through the crevice in their conditions, but it was the weirdest thing. As soon as we made the decision to leave, we just made it out. Somehow we didn't have to retrace our steps or go back through the oozing crack. We started walking, and the first tunnel we took led us straight out of the cave within an hour. You found another entrance? I asked. He shook his head. No, that's the weird part. It took us out the same entrance we'd gone in, even though there was only 1 tunnel down into the cave from there, and it should have taken several hours to retrace that route. It's like the cave rearranged itself. What about Evan and Keith? Are they okay? Have they been at work? The questions seemed to tumble out now. Everything was so confusing and I needed to know more. I needed to know how all of this connected, and how it had affected my husband. They've been at work, Jackson said quietly. The doctors saw nothing unusual on Evan's MRIs. He seems fine now, and he slept with 3 different women in the last week. So I guess he's recovered. Keith has been acting weird, and he disappears for hours at a time. He won't let anyone see the wound on his side, especially doctors. I'm worried about him. He looked up and met my eyes. Chris, too. What about you? I said, finally realizing that I should have asked how he was when I first arrived, considering how bad he looked. Did you get to test that sample at the lab? Maybe you found out something helpful. Jackson was shaking his head before I'd even finished speaking. No. The vial I'd collected the sample in broke when I squeezed through that crevice. It was in my pocket and I felt the glass pierce through my thigh. The vial was empty by the time I was able to fish it out afterwards. He paused and looked down at his bandaged hands. And no, I'm not okay either. I'm going to show you what's happening to me. Please don't scream, he said softly, cautiously, like he was talking to a skittish animal. I nodded, swallowing back any protests, and he began to unwrap the bandages. When he was done, he held up his hands for me to see, and this time all the fake coughs in the world couldn't hide my noise of shock and horror. I think I almost fainted. His hands were, well, they weren't really his hands anymore. They consisted of a black liquid, almost like tar, that was constantly moving and swirling as if it were a river. They were still roughly in the shape of hands, but that's where the similarities ended. My legs and arms, too, Jackson said. It started at my thigh, where the vial cut me, and where the sample must have entered. It's spreading, and it's conscious. I can hear it whispering to me about making me its own. I don't think I have long left until it takes over. He looked up at me again, and his eyes shifted from their usual blue. Suddenly they were filled with the same swirling black ooze. It says it wants to spread, to multiply, he whispered, in a voice that was almost his, but not quite. All the things in that cave want to extend their reach far beyond, to infect others, to reproduce. He smiled a crooked grin at me, his eyes still terrifyingly dark, and it took every ounce of self-control not to scream. I slowly inched away and started to stand up, but he chuckled. Don't worry, I won't do anything to you. You've already been claimed after all. Someone else wants you. Jackson's eyes flashed back to blue. Go, he said, this time in his normal voice, sounding strained. You can't help me. Go, I'm sorry. That was all I needed. His eyes were already being taken over by the wave of black again as I turned and bolted out his front door, panting, scared that he, or it, really, might pursue. But true to its word, I was left alone, and I made it to my car, still breathing like I'd just finished a race. I don't know how long I sat there, trying to make sense of what Jackson had told me and what he had shown me. Although, whatever I had just left behind, I'm pretty sure it wasn't Jackson anymore. Which was terrifying because what did that mean for Chris? Had something burrowed down inside of him, like whatever was in Evan's brain? I had no doubt that was real, since sleeping with women sounded exactly like Chris's efforts with me. Had something replaced him entirely and only looked like my husband? Either way, the thing that had been living with me wasn't Chris. I knew that now. And the most terrifying thing was that Jackson, or the thing that used to be Jackson, had said last, something else wants you. Because that sounded exactly like Chris's catchphrase these days. I want you, I want you, I want you. My blood ran cold when I thought of all the implications that could have, and what kind of something else Chris might be, and what it, wanted with me. I went home eventually because I had no choice. I think some part of me still hoped I could save him too. But I avoided him as much as possible after that. Any research about saving him would be done at a distance. He knew where I'd been. I didn't tell him, but I could tell he knew, because he stopped trying to put on an act. He just stared at me all the time with the same creepy smile on his face, and he wouldn't let me leave after that. I mean, at all. He locked down the house, and I haven't left since. Nor have I had more than a few minutes without him watching me. I missed any chance I had to get away. You don't have to tell me it was stupid to come back. Trust me, I regret it. I tried to escape, but I don't think I'd get very far. He knows more than he should, always. And I think it's too late for me anyway, because last week, I missed my period. Chris knew without me mentioning it, and he handed me a pregnancy test a day later. I don't know how or when he got it, but he stood outside the bathroom door while I took it, and then sat on the edge of the bathtub while we waited for the results. I sat on the toilet, my heart beating so loud I was afraid he would hear it. I'd always thought finding out I was pregnant would be one of the most exciting moments in my life, and that Chris and I would celebrate it together. Instead, I was filled with fear at what the test might prove, and Chris's smile as he watched me only made my skin crawl. It took a few minutes to confirm what both of us already expected. I promptly jumped to my feet and managed to lift the toilet lid just in time to throw up. Chris's hand was on my back in an instant. There, he said as I continued to puke up my guts. There was no element of comfort to his voice. I knew that whatever was coming, it wouldn't be good. I'd known for a while, really, but now there was no denying it. My husband wasn't my husband, and whatever was inside of me probably wasn't a human child, and I was absolutely terrified. As soon as I'd finished puking, he turned me around to face him. In that moment, still feeling nauseous, my heart thumping and my blood cold, I finally realized what had been wrong with his eyes all this time. They'd always been a lovely shade of deep brown, and so it was hardly noticeable unless you were really looking. They had no pupils. He stared at me with his pupilless eyes, a deep hunger within them. "I told you I wanted you, and I meant it," he whispered. "I want you, and I want what you can give me." His awful grin grew even wider, if that was possible, until it seemed to take up his entire face, except for those goddamn eyes. He reached down and placed a hand on my belly, and his next words were the most chilling of all. "I can't wait to see what we made together." This week's vacation is such a relief. Getting to take a little vacation away from the big city and see the leaves change color somewhere a little more pastoral during these socially isolated times. The small town of Galena, Illinois, has been a big tourist destination for a while, drawing tons of investors and suburbanites alike to build new construction all over the place. Now, besides the town itself, the woods have given way to golf courses and the hills have been dotted with vacation or rental houses. Over my life, well, before this week's vacation, I've taken quite a few trips up here, but there was one house that I'd never go back to, just this side of the river and downtown. This was, about 6 years ago now, when we were all just out of college and starting to make a little money for adult vacations for the first time in our lives. Our group was my buddy Brandon, his sister Jessica, our other pal Phil, and me. It was, as you can imagine, one of the older houses around there, built long ago as part of the actual town, instead of rising to meet the flood of demand back in the booming 80s, and not at all like the houses by the golf course in Eagle Ridge. Like the house we're staying at as I write this, actually. It was a really lovely place, and we loved taking walking trips just across the river into downtown, or through Grant Park along that riverfront trail. The place was old, with all the hallmarks of an old but well-kept house. Old sinks with new faucet spouts so you didn't have to deal with separate hot and cold taps. Clawfoot bathtubs that were somehow shiny and pristine instead of moldy and foreboding. An open and elaborate foyer with a grand staircase leading to the more subdued bedrooms. And, miraculously, plenty of hot water running through those pipes. And those pipes gurgled and they rattled. From the moment we set our suitcases down to the moments we packed them up and fled in the middle of the night, whenever anything drained or you opened up one of the taps, it sounded like a giant slurping down the dregs of its soup or shaking the bars of its cage. And when you ran the dishwasher, yeah, a real dishwasher, clashing with the authentic feel of the old, iron, wood-burning stove in the living room, but incredibly convenient to tenants. The house rang like a church's belfry for hours. We quickly learned to live with it and use our water in bursts to minimize the interference with daily living. If someone wanted to watch a quiet or a solemn movie, they knew better than to try to do it first thing in the morning when everyone showered, or last thing at night when we ran the dishes. We made sure running the dishes was the last thing any of us did at night. After the board games and the booze and the leftovers were all put away, the slurping and creaking and clattering would be too loud to hear anything else less than a shout. Of course, this meant we all learned to sleep through a lot of noise. And the first step of learning to sleep through something is learning to ignore it. We all had a lot of experience turning out background noise, growing up in the same small suburb. And I keep practicing it to this day living in the city. Out in the suburbs, it was the constant noises of planes taking off or landing at O'Hare, and the distant, low rumbling of freight trains in the dead of the night. Nowadays, it's the distant screech and rattle of the L trains, or ambulance sirens pealing through the neighborhood, or just good old-fashioned pipe gurgling. Needless to say, We weren't going to let some noisy plumbing alone ruin our getaway. But getting used to the clatter and groan of metal and wood expanding and contracting all over the house wasn't enough to keep us there. You see, when my lizard brain woke me up in the dead of the third night of the trip, I couldn't figure out what it was that made my spine tingle and my skin break out in goosebumps. At first, all I could hear was the gurgle and creak of old plumbing, like usual. But there was a sound underneath that, in a completely different register than any of the other sounds. It didn't sound like metal expanding, and it didn't sound like wood creaking. It sounded somehow more tinny, wet, and somehow crackling. I got out of bed at 2 a.m, throwing the covers aside and stepping away from the bed quickly. An old habit I've had since staying up late reading scary stories in bed. It's impossible not to imagine a hand reaching out and grasping your ankles after you've read enough scary stories with your bedside lamp as your only protection from the dark underbelly of your bed. I grabbed my phone off its charger and turned its flashlight feature on. Nearly sweating in the few moments I stood there in the dark. I wanted to stay quiet and unobtrusive, not clicking all the lights up and sounding the alarm, since I couldn't sense anything to truly sound an alarm about. So I crept out of my bedroom and, to my surprise, found Brandon standing at the bottom of the stairs as I crept down it. He was tall and stout and red-headed, and stood out like a torchlit lighthouse warning of imminent peril. The stairs were creaky as all hell, but nothing compared to the clanking that was thrumming through the house as hot water ran through the house like hot blood through arteries. "What are you?" I began, but Brandon raised his hand in a simple shush, although it was more like a grim talk to the hand, and pointed ahead of him. Right there in front of him was a door we'd done our best to put out of our mind. It was a storage closet, right by the entry into the foyer, and across from where the grand staircase bent, near its bottom, to empty onto the first floor. Locked, of course, but we'd had to try it, giving the knob a few jiggles as we were first exploring the house, then noticing the padlock next to it, making sure we knew the ins and outs of bounds for us guests. I hadn't given it a second thought, until that moment, when I saw the doorknob twisting. That was the sound I couldn't place. Or, at least, one of them. Someone was implicably rattling the doorknob of the locked closet from the inside. We both watched as the knob circled in place, back and forth, little rotations, steady like the pendulum of an old clock. The door was secured with a latch hastily attached to the front of it, holding the door to the wall, and an old padlock keeping the latch tightly shut. We stood there, gaping at it, for what felt like forever, the unadorned knob beginning to change its pace, first slow, then a panicked rattle, then slow again. Like it was trying to figure out some sort of strange combination lock, completely unaware of the real force holding the door shut. Then Brandon slowly reached out, the full moon of his palm hovering just an inch or two away from the knob. He was steeling himself, breathing in and out in harsh little gasps through his nose. He was just about to do it, and closed his eyes when I hissed, "Wait." The handle had stopped moving, and in the place of that awful racket, a different sound struggled to make itself heard over the noises of the pipes, which seemed to be at their loudest right there, outside that closet. It was a scratching sound, like long fingernails delicately tracing along the flimsy wooden panel, and something that almost sounded like a child's whimper. Brandon's sister, Jessica, was right behind us on the stairs. "Oh my God," she said. "Someone's locked in the closet. How?" "I don't think," I began, but Phil came down the stairs right behind her, rubbing his eyes. "What the fuck's this?" he asked. Then, again, the long, slow sounds of nails dragging along wood. Phil stared a moment, then said, "Well, that's fucking bizarre." "We have to get them out of there," Jessica said. "I got this," Phil said, and ran back up the stairs. We all stood there transfixed by the sound, but Phil came back with his padlock after a few seconds. He was, let's say, proficient with them, and it took him less than a couple minutes to spring the padlock open by the lights of our smartphones, and flipped the latch free. As the door creaked open, pushed out from inside, the smell of sulfur hit us, and we saw the source of all the sounds in the house, lit from 3 different locations as we stood there in awe. A writhing mass of limbs, with too many joints to be human, wolf, or even spider, undulated and groped for something. The closet was full of pipes reaching through the house, like the heart of the whole place, but tangled in there were those impossibly long arms, dozens of them, reaching out. Almost all of them were grabbing at the pipes and rattling them, and all those pipes poured out into a dark circle on the floor. The arms were impossible to trace back to their origin, shrouded back in the darkness of that closet, but the source of the gurgling and that smell was obviously that dark hole the pipes all drained into, so much louder then than it had been before, almost roaring. It was lined with wet, white ridges that I mistook for tiles at first, but now I think they were teeth. The hand had been scratching its long, dirt-specked nails along the wood, groped blindly at the floor just outside its cage, then rose back into the air, seeming to float along on nothing, the ropes of its muscles standing out like taut cords on a mast, something hidden behind it pulling those strings like a puppeteer. All of its joints were creaking and snapping like sails being yanked around in a gale, and each hand had long, sickly yellow fingernails and white, cracked skin at every joint and knuckle. As soon as we saw it, Brandon slammed the door back shut. The hand was already partway out, and the arm caught in the jam. The hand blindly groped around like an octopus in the deepest trenches of the ocean, and it grabbed Brandon's arm. There was a sick sizzling, and I realized the hands themselves were as hot as... No, they were heating the pipes, scalding Brandon. Phil grabbed the arm right back and screamed as he pulled the arm off of Brandon. Brandon relented his grip on the door, stumbling back. As the arm pulled away, Phil pushed it back up through the slim crack of the open door, still gritting his teeth and screaming as he burned, and I ran forward to slam the door back shut. Jessica had gotten over her shock well enough to grab the padlock and secure the latch back in place. We bandaged Phil's hand with ointment from Jessica's first aid supplies, and then all packed up and left that night. We never talked about it again. We never vacationed together again either taking each other for granted or too scared to be reminded of our flirtation with the unknown. Brandon died earlier this year. I saw it on Facebook from one of our other friends. I hadn't thought about any of this in years, but it certainly came back to me lately. After seeing that obituary, by all accounts, he led a happy and healthy life, got married, had a kid. I never found out what he died from, but it was a closed casket. Phil moved out to Rockford a while back, not long after that vacation. The last I was ever able to find out about him was an arrest record for reckless, drunken driving. I don't know if he's still around. I sometimes wonder now if they were ever able to really forget about it. For me, I always have to work to put it out of my mind whenever I hear old house noises. Where I'm living alone, the pipes have always been noisy, so it's been a bit of a struggle. Fortunately, memories can't hurt you. Physically, at least. But right before we left for this weekend, I saw something that made me very glad to be getting away. In the back of my closet, when I was packing up, I noticed thin lines had begun to form, lines I'd never seen before. It looked like a door was emerging from the sheetrock, or I had somehow missed a small door that was always there, or it had been papered over and only now revealed. The night before we left, I could swear I heard a knob twisting, just like we heard that night, even though there's just a faint, square outline there. I was hoping this weekend could give me some perspective and I could look at it when we got back. The only problem is, the door followed me. I saw it right away when we got here, in the decidedly less grand foyer of this vacation home, and God help me, it sounds like the doorknob has come unstuck. Right off the bat, I'm going to say I can't disclose the name of my university. I know that makes me lose a lot of credibility, but I'm a senior entering the job market, and based off of my friends, family, security, school administrations, everyone I've told, reactions, having the story even remotely related to me could seriously hurt my chances of starting a career. That being said, I still want to share my experience just in case at least one person believes me and avoids making the same mistake. So here it goes. It was the first semester of my senior year, right around finals season. I had a fair number of classes where I needed to nail the final to get a decent grade, so I was holed up in the library most of the time. Oh, I forgot to mention, my university's library isn't open 24/7. They close up at 12:30 a.m. They alert the students on the loudspeaker repeatedly and send security out to sweep the floors and classrooms. It's annoying, but there's a few other places on campus that you can move to keep studying. Anyways, because of COVID and online classes, a lot of the classrooms were converted to study spaces since professors didn't need them for teaching. I'd commandeered one of those classrooms for myself, and to make sure no one else would come in to disturb me, I locked the door. I figure I could watch the time and hear the announcement on the loudspeaker, even if the security guards couldn't come in to get me out. Unfortunately, I was getting really into these review videos for my biology class. God bless Khan Academy. And by the time I looked at the clock, it was 1:17 a.m. I couldn't remember hearing the loudspeaker announcement, but then again, my headphones had been in for the good part of an hour. I wanted to fill up my water bottle and the library was dead empty. No students, no security guards, no janitors, nothing. I wasn't surprised, and it was so cool. There was something special about having a place that I had spent most of my undergrad in all to myself. I did stupid things, running through the first floor stacks, snooping behind the information desk, dancing in the middle of the student conversation section. After I got the willies out, I stood there just, I don't know, listening. The longer I stood there, the more uncomfortable I got. The floor-to-ceiling windows that wrapped around the library made me uneasy with how dark and reflective they were. It was weird, but I figure it was because it was 1:45 a.m., and I was completely alone in a massive building. Just general thinking too hard about things, heebie-jeebies. I went back to studying and locked the door to the classroom again, just to make myself feel better. It felt stupid, but at the same time, it didn't work. 10 minutes into my note cards and I could barely focus. I felt jittery and on edge. I still figured it was nothing. I'd been downing coffee all day. I was overtired. And once again, alone in an empty, silent building. I picked up my stuff and went to try the entrance to the library. The doors were automatic, so I thought there was a good chance that they weren't locked and just not turned on, allowing me to force them open. Nope, locked. I went around to the back entrance, which is rarely locked, except that night, of course. I picked up my phone to call one of my housemates to see if they could help break me out, but my phone was dead. I dug through my bag, hoping on the off chance I had brought my charger, but I never do, so it wasn't a shocker to not find it. I started to panic, justifying how I felt with the fact that I was locked in and couldn't go home until 8 a.m. when the library reopened. But it wasn't that. I was sweating at this point, hair on my arms standing up on end, heart pounding. Logically, I could have just gone up to the 5th floor lounge and slept on the couches. I'd done it before as a quick nap between classes, but I couldn't. I was wide awake. Instead, I decided to walk around to check out the floors, maybe get back into that special, happy, introspective mood I was in when I first found out I had the place to myself. I stopped lying to myself on the 3rd floor, the Latin American Studies floor. To be fair, it was decorated for Dia de los Muertos, so there were skeletons everywhere, so maybe that set me off. But I doubt it. They were dressed up in costumes, dresses, makeup, etc. Not super terrifying. I was moving the stacks back and forth, peeking between the shelves. You know how some parts of a library will have shelves that can move to save space? Of course, there were signs everywhere telling people to check between them to make sure you weren't crushing someone. And then I saw something flicker out of the corner of my eye. I was jumpy and anxious, so this wasn't surprising. What was surprising was the fact that I could have sworn I saw a long, thin finger disappearing into the shelf behind me. But those shelves were less than 4 inches apart. There was no way anyone could have been standing there. But like I said, I was done lying to myself. I was terrified. Something was wrong. I sprinted out of there, and after that I was sure that sleeping wasn't an option. I had to keep moving. You know how I said earlier the library was empty and silent? I was wrong on both accounts. As the night dragged on, I kept hearing rustling like book pages and loud, unexplained thuds. I realized that if I made a lot of noise or stayed in one place, they'd get closer. I got good at figuring out which directions to move, but I was definitely outnumbered. No matter what floor I ran to, the sounds followed me. It seemed like my presence would disturb or, I don't know, awaken something. It was just the sounds until around 5 a.m. I wouldn't say I'd gotten comfortable, but I knew the pattern. I knew what to expect. Move a floor, hear a rustle. Move across the room, stand behind the stacks, hear a thud, change positions. When I heard more than one sound in a row in the same spot, or one that seemed too close, change floors. Space the floors out. If I went to 6, I'd go to 2, then 5, basement, 3, 6, 1, 4, etc. Alternate between the elevators and the staircases. But on the 5th floor, as I was getting off the elevator, I saw something. Holy shit, I thought I was gonna piss myself. Those giant reflective windows that had given me the heebie-jeebies a couple hours earlier came back to bite me in the ass. Or save me? I don't know. But I looked at the window and saw myself. Man, I look like crap. Bloodshot eyes, panicked expression, pale. But I was nothing compared to what I saw behind me. I understood how I saw the finger, because slinking around the corner was the longest, thinnest thing I'd ever seen. It was human, but like Slenderman-esque human, like it was stretched out beyond how thin bones should be. It would have been more than narrow enough to slide between the closed stacks behind me. I wish I could say I snapped around, ran to the shelf to uncover the mystery. Fuck that. I stood there, frozen, staring at the reflection until I watched whatever it was move past my field of vision. The worst part was, I could barely see the body between the books. It was so slender. If I hadn't known it was there, I would have never caught it. After that, I was a mess. I didn't stop moving. Anytime I had the breath to run, I would. I felt insane racing through a building, but at the same time, it seemed like the only option. Looking back, I'm still not convinced it wasn't the only option. Everything I heard seemed closer. I saw more flickers out of the corner of my eye that kept resembling long, outstretched limbs, reflections of things slinking between bookshelves. I don't know how I made it to 7:45. I figured either they'd close in or my heart would give out. But it came. And I know it came because that's when the elevator started running. I was on the 2nd floor across the hall from them when I heard the whirring. I am proud that time I didn't freeze. I ran across the library to see all the lights on the elevators lit, pointing up. Then I froze. I wanted to vomit. I honestly had never given much thought to the types of creatures I was dealing with, and for some reason it never occurred to me that they could go up and down the stairs and use elevators. I had this idea that they were confined to the floors I had heard them on. I was wrong. I ran to the stairs and I figured that maybe, if worse came to worse, I could throw the heavy-duty electric stapler through a window to make it out alive. Thank God this whole time I had perfected running down the stairs almost completely silent. At the landing before the 1st floor, I heard something that made me realize what monumental mistake I'd made. Have you ever seen that video of that creepy girl that runs and jumps like a horse? Hands and feet on the ground at the same time? The video has always freaked me out. And what I heard coming up the stairs from the basement, just 5 flights away from me, was the slapping of hands and feet against the ground as if something was running just like that creepy fucking girl. The elevators are a trap. I don't know why they hadn't cornered me earlier in the night, because it was clear they are intelligent enough to set up traps that I would fall for, no questions asked. They probably enjoyed watching me sweat. But for anyone else that finds themselves in this situation, the elevators are a trap. It's a ploy to force you down the stairways. When you hear the sound of those hands and feet slapping the ground, you need to start running. Run as fast as you can. I was able to get myself in a first-floor elevator, and as soon as the doors closed, I slammed the emergency button, hoping that it would keep me safe for the last 15 minutes of that fucking night. Why didn't you do that earlier? Yeah, I've heard that before. It's because I was scared out of my wits. Didn't think of it, and honestly, being trapped in that small space the whole night seems like a great way to make me a sitting duck for whatever is out there in the stacks. But it was the longest 15 minutes of the night. I'm not ashamed to admit that I started sobbing. Every thud I heard from outside seemed to be getting closer. And when the elevator started moving again and the doors finally opened, I felt my vision narrowing to a pinpoint. To see the security guard standing there staring at me was a bigger relief than anything else I've ever felt. She was looking at me with a mix of concern and pity, and after that, I don't remember. Exhaustion, relief, anxiety, all of it coming to an end. I passed out. Later on, everyone agreed that while I did end up getting locked in the library, everything else was a figment of my overworked, exhausted brain. My phone was dead. I have no proof. I know I sound crazy. But it seems like overkill that the afternoon the next day, the president of the university sent a school-wide announcement via email urging students to not ignore the 12:30 closing time of the library, or that security now makes 3 sweeps of the classrooms instead of 2, and has a skeleton key for all the rooms in the building. Either way, I never went back to the library for the rest of the semester, and I never intend to go back to a library late at night ever again. I don't know if this happens in all places, but I don't want to find out.